Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Gates, Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. Thank you for joining this webinar entitled, And You May Ask Yourself, How Did We Get Here? A Brief History of Historic Preservation in the United States. The format for today's webinar will include an hour presentation followed by time for questions and answers. There is a toolbar on the right side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and I will either reply to you or hold the question until the end for the panelists to answer. You will be muted throughout the entire presentation. To hide and unhide this toolbar, simply click on the orange arrow. Today's presentation will be by Jay Platt. Jay is the Historic Preservation Planner for the City of Glendale, where he is responsible for the city's preservation program, including serving as staff liaison to the Historic Preservation Commission. He is a member of the city's Urban Design Studio, in which he conducts design review and helps develop and implement planning policy. Jay is also an instructor in USC School of Architecture, despite going to UCLA undergrad, teaching classes in master's programs in heritage conservation. Previously, he served as the preservation advocate for the Los Angeles Conservancy, working on preservation issues throughout Los Angeles County. Though a Los Angeles native, Jay lived in the Northeast for 12 years, getting his master's in historic preservation at the University of Pennsylvania, followed by a move to New York City. While there, he worked as the city's Landmark Preservation Commission, private consultant Building Conservation Associates, and the Historic Districts Council, a nonprofit advocacy group. Thank you for joining us today, Jay.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Hello to my disembodied friends out there. I'm glad that you're interested in the subject. I think it's a really fun one, and I hope in this kind of whirlwind coverage of 175, maybe even 200 years of our history as preservationists, that you'll learn a few things and you'll kind of see how we got here. You know, there are two Talking Heads references in this presentation, one of which is, and you may ask yourself, how did we get here? But before I look at that, I wanted to start thinking about what makes us want to preserve places in the first place. So here we are going to Rome. We're leaving the country for a second. And by the 8th century, there's already this issue of, you know, how buildings are incredibly meaningful to us. The Venerable Bede wrote, "While stands the Colosseum, Rome shall stand. When falls the Colosseum, Rome shall fall. And when Rome falls, the world." So that's a lot of weight to kind of put on the status of one building. But what this really tells me is that, you know, it's almost universal. For the longest time, we've recognized the tremendous power that places have in our lives and how we use places, how we live in them, and the places that we make. And we often take their loss as a personal loss. And sometimes it seems that this ability to kind of put meaning into the bricks and mortar is, you know, one of our most telling traits as humans, and it's practically a universal trait. And when things happen, when the Penn Stations of the world do come down, and we worry that, as the New York Times wrote, we'll be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we've destroyed, we should remember that losses like that one have often propelled our field forward. As we look at the history of preservation, we see a clear pattern of losses, or the fear of loss, that lead to positive developments such as new preservation groups forming, new ordinances, new advocacy agendas. And this is typically driven by the grassroots. What's really interesting about preservation in the United States is from the beginning, it was a grassroots movement. Some of those roots were pretty well watered and were pretty much roots tied to very rich people in the beginning. But nonetheless, it took a long time for the government to kind of get involved, especially at the federal government level. So here we are in America now, back from Rome, back from New York. We're anywhere. And if you're asking yourself, how did we get here? To a point where we can choose whether or not our city wants to have the power to tell people what color to paint or not to paint their house, we're going to look at a few specific cases that help us see how the successes and losses over the years have helped our field mature, and how in 200 years we've gotten to the place that we are today. I didn't create these divisions, but basically this is the framework that we're going to use to organize the discussion. We can put the history of preservation in the U.S. into a rough breakdown that follows these three groupings: an associative patriotic period that lasted throughout the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th, kind of a more aesthetic but also educational phase that took up the first half of the 20th century, and then a professional phase where we are today that really started in the 50s and by the 60s really came to the forefront. And there's a lot of overlap in these dates, so don't take them that seriously, but they'll just give you a general idea as we move into our discussion of the associative phase. So ladies and gentlemen, here they are. Please welcome the great white men. You've heard that before, but it's true. Most of our early preservation efforts were focused on the revolution, the founding of the Republic, and the men who made that happen. And this became the period's dominant preservation approach, to look at these people and figure out how are we going to commemorate the great men who helped found the country through the buildings that they lived in, that they worked in, that they touched in one way or another. So the first real preservation battle of significance in the country, I've heard of some smaller ones that happened years and years earlier, but we don't have a lot of information about those, was Independence Hall. So this building was completed by 1753 as the State House for Pennsylvania, and I'm sure you're all familiar with what's happened there. Declaration of Independence was signed, the Liberty Bell was rung, constitutional conventions developed our Constitution. But in 1813, just 25 years after the Constitutional Convention, the state actually proposed selling the building for private development. This didn't go over well with a lot of citizens. One was quoted as saying, "The spot which the bill proposes to cover with private buildings is hallowed to your memorialists by many strong and impressive recollections." So the proposal was dropped, thankfully, at the time. And here we go. This is where preservation really begins. There's a sense that places matter, that places can be a seat of memory, and that protecting them and preserving them is important to our heritage. Well, so much for that. In 1816, the state came back and did the same exact thing. They proposed to sell the building and the square it's in for subdivision as building lots. I think this has a lot of interest in terms of our work with the recent past these days. Maybe this was all too fresh for people to see that this building had as much meaning as it does, but thankfully a lot of people feel like we do today. You know, we're more the same as we were then than we're different. And the provision was made in the state's proposal to allow the city of Philadelphia to buy the site for $70,000, and the city went ahead and did that. So thankfully, because of that, Independence Hall was saved. And this is a pretty easy victory as these things go, but the story of the building is one of change over the years. So it continued to change and kind of shows us that our current attachment to historic fabric and fetishizing materials and historic integrity wasn't really shared by these early associative preservationists. In 1781, even before the preservation battles, the tower came down, as you can see in the top image. And this was removed. This was the site where the Liberty Bell rang. But people were like, oh, there's wood rot. We've got to take it down. So the tower went away. And over the years, other changes happened. The wings were torn down. New wings were built. In the early 19th century, for about 20 years, Charles Willson Peale had his museum of kind of oddities, mastodon bones and stuffed birds, in the rooms where the founders met and signed the Declaration of Independence. So our idea of this sacrosanct place really wasn't true, and here we have kind of an early example of adaptive reuse, which is kind of fun to think of it that way. In 1828, William Strickland added a new tower. This came close to looking like the original tower, but was definitely a modern tower. Again and again, the building keeps changing, even down to the paneling in the assembly room, which the original paneling was removed in 1816, and that was the wood that reverberated with the founders' voices, if you want to look at it that way. That's now gone through 2 generations of paneling. So the building we see today is really a product of many changes, and we've learned a lot as preservationists through these changes. It's been an ongoing discussion, how can we restore this building closer and closer to its original appearance? And now that it's run by the Park Service, they did a lot of work before the bicentennial to get this up and running for the tourists who were coming, including the insertion of lots of steel under the floors and the stairways. So now we have a steel reinforced historic building where historic things happened in the room that's very different from the way it was, but as close as we can make it as preservationists. So it's an interesting story to start with, but we'll have a number of case studies as we go on. And here's Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's house, and Thomas Jefferson ultimately died in debt. So when he died, his daughter ended up having to sell the house in 1829, and it was bought by a man who actively disliked Jefferson and didn't really even like the house, but he did like the land and the area it was in because he wanted to be a silkworm farmer. So he started his silkworm farm, but that soon failed. The house started to kind of deteriorate during this period. But in 1836, it was bought by a naval officer and a New York businessman named Uriah Levy. And he bought it specifically because of its associations with Jefferson. Before he began to restore it, and he's quoted as saying, "I consider Jefferson to be one of the greatest men in history, the author of the Declaration and an absolute Democrat. He serves as an inspiration to millions of Americans. He did much to mold our republic in a form in which a man's religion does not make him ineligible for political or governmental life." So as a Jew, Levy, who must have gone through a lot of struggles as a religious minority, even in our religiously free country, looked to Jefferson as a kind of a standard bearer for the freedoms that he sought and the success that he was able to achieve. He died in 1862. He never really lived in the house, but he did do restoration work to start it on the path toward where we have it today. And he's really the first example of a private sector preservationist, and this is why the early Monticello story is interesting for us, where just an individual came forward, said, "I have the money to do this, I'm going to do it, I'm going to help restore the house. I'm not going to open it as a museum, it's going to still remain a house," which is something that we appreciate today. But unfortunately, when he died in 1862, he left the house to the people of the United States. His idea, because he was a Commodore in the Navy, was to make it a home for Navy orphans. But Congress turned him down. The Civil War had just started, and they were like, we can't deal with this right now. So ultimately, his will was contested for about 20 years, and the place really went to seed. I've read some stories about a caretaker who went mad, or mad with power, or I'm not sure what happened, so I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but evidently the place really, really went downhill. This upper picture you see may be an indicator of some of that condition. In 1879, ultimately, Levy's nephew, Jefferson, interesting name, Jefferson Monroe Levy, who was a member of the House from New York and also a businessman, bought the house and started his restoration. And over the years, he lived in the house, worked on it. There were a lot of ugly allegations of anti-Semitism and that he wasn't interested in giving the house to the country to whom it belonged. Ultimately, a foundation formed, the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, and jumping ahead in 1923, and they bought the house from Levy, and they still own it. So this, for us today, is really the first example that I know of what we would call private sector preservation without any government influence, government money, or anything else. Now, stepping back a little, we have something, a building that wasn't really associated with the Great White Men. It was associated with all of the people who settled the country and had to endure wars and Indian raids and problems such as that. So this is a house in Deerfield, Massachusetts, and the outcome of the story may be all too familiar for some of you. In 1704, there was a small war called the Queen Anne's War, in which French forces joined with some of the local Indian tribes to assault the settlers in New England. So during this assault in Deerfield, this house was attacked. Point that you can see in the lower picture that hatchets were taken to the front door for a musket to go through, and the residents were threatened at gunfire. So it really became a story because ultimately the Indians and the French were, the town went back to kind of its old ways, and the house went back to just being a house again. But like all things happen, change comes, and in 1847, what came to be known as the Old Indian House was put up for sale. And people were concerned about this, and we all know the idea, like something goes up for sale, we better watch out, we're worried what's going to happen. So that happened in Deerfield. And there was an effort made to save it from destruction. One of the people petitioning for its preservation said, "Can worthy sons of noble sirs see the destruction of that solitary memento of departed days, so rich in reminiscences and so varied in its pictures of past scenes, and not say to the fiat, 'Spare that house'?" So the call of "spare that house" is something that we're still saying in slightly different language today. We're saying this place matters. So ultimately a collection was taken up, and an observer later recalled, and if any of you are in the advocacy end of our field, you're going to be able to relate to this. The observer said, "A few worked hard, but scarcely no money was subscribed." So the idea was people wanted to buy the house to save it, but they couldn't really get enough people interested, so it was torn down in 1848. However, something was saved, and it was that very door that was attacked with hatchets and that the musket was pointed through. So the door was saved, and some of the woodwork from around the door And ultimately, a memorial hall was built for the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association, and the door still sits in that space, reminiscent, a nostalgic reminder of the past. And I think it's interesting, you know, this is not what we call preservation under CEQA today. This isn't real preservation, just saving an artifact rather than the building itself. But nonetheless, especially because you can see these marks on the door, I think it's a very potent reminder of the courage and the effort that was made to settle the country. And I think even in this kind of quasi-preserved condition, we can see that this is something that was important for people to take. Unfortunately, I can only imagine a bumper sticker that says, hey, we survived the raid on Deerfield and all we got was this lousy door. Because obviously we'd rather have the house. So here's the granddaddy of all associations. The Washington slept here. Washington carried off to the heavens because he was our most sainted figure. When he died in 1799, the outpouring of grief was tremendous. And that began the period of kind of the semi-deification of George Washington. It seems that almost everything he touched was memorialized in one way or another. And the preservation of a few of the sites associated with him, however, are actually significant in the development of our field. Hasbrook House in upstate New York in Newburgh was built in 1750 and served as Washington's headquarters for 2 years during the Revolutionary War. And this was his longest served headquarters. So it had a pretty strong association with him, and he spent a lot of time in the building and made a lot of important decisions in the building. So when this came on the market, it was acquired by the state of New York, specifically as a memorial to Washington and to be opened as a house museum. So this is really our first example of the government, kind of the government beyond the local government, the state government, getting involved and buying a property specifically for its preservation. With Independence Hall, it was kind of like, did they buy it for its preservation or did they just buy it to keep it from being torn down? Not that those aren't sort of the same, but it's definitely a different situation. The real story that helps us move forward as preservationists is with Mount Vernon. So George died in 1799 and his wife Martha died in 1802. And in this case, as opposed to Jefferson's, the house stayed in the family for 3 generations. But by the 1850s, it was in pretty bad shape. And his great-great-nephew, John Augustine Washington, Jr., offered to sell the place to the federal government or to the Commonwealth of Virginia. And the idea was, this is Washington's house. Surely the government is going to want to buy this and do something with it. But in both cases, his offer was declined. And it was felt that it was an improper use to spend taxpayers' money to acquire private property. So thankfully that attitude has changed over the years, but luckily this great-great-nephew refused to sell the building for commercial purposes. During this time, a mother, we'll just say it's a mother, a woman's mother, saw the house as she was riding down the Potomac, and she wrote a note to her daughter. It was a lovely moonlit night that we went down the Potomac. I went on deck as the bell tolled and we passed Mount Vernon. I was painfully distressed at the ruin and desolation of the home of Washington, and the thought passed through my mind, why was it that the women of his country did not try to keep it in repair if the men could not do it? It does seem such a blot on our country. So Anne Pamela Cunningham was evidently a very good daughter. She took her mother's recommendation to heart and founded the country's first preservation organization, which was also the first women's organization in the country. So excuse me, I didn't advance the slides. Here's some of the deteriorated condition, and you can see the porch is being kept up by struts. And here we are with Anne Pamela Cunningham. So she established the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1853 and appealed to the American people for $200,000. This was an unprecedented grassroots fundraising campaign. She was very smart. She brought in vice regents from all of the 30 states at the time. And what this did was it extended the fundraising capacity. It wasn't just looking to the Virginia community where Mount Vernon's located, but was looking around the entire country and got women involved. And this is really a fascinating aspect of preservation. The field has been dominated by women for so many years, and it really kind of goes back to Anne Pamela Cunningham establishing this group. And when we think today of the First Ladies being involved in preservation and Lady Bird Johnson being involved in beautification efforts, it really all goes back to the efforts in the 1850s of these ladies. So by 1858, they had enough money. They were able to buy the mansion, they bought the outbuildings, and they bought 200 acres, and they opened it to the public in 1860. The group is recognized as the first national preservation organization in the country, but their work wasn't over. They ended up restoring the house, they brought in furnishings, and they actually still run the site. When she retired, Anne Pamela Cunningham said, "Ladies, the home of Washington is in your charge. See to it that you keep it the home of Washington. Let no irreverent hand change it, no vandal hands desecrate it with the fingers of progress. Those who go to the home in which he lived and died wish to see in what he lived and died. Let one spot in this grand country of ours be saved from change. Upon you rests this duty." So change is, for so many of us, seen as a bogeyman, when obviously as preservationists we make changes all the time. Change is what we do. Of course, our goal is to manage change so that we protect important resources, but there's kind of an interesting side note at Mount Vernon that came up later in the century. Phoebe Apperson Hearst, related to William Randolph Hearst, was one of the regents, and she was the California regent. And she contacted Thomas Edison, who was interested in expanding the use of electric lights, and the thought was that Mount Vernon would be a magnificent place, kind of a test case for electric lighting. So she brought this forward to the Ladies Association, and many, many people were deeply opposed and frightened by this and thought, how can we have electric lights in the home in which Washington lived? That is too big of a change. Hearst kind of was pretty smart and figured out a way to get them to kind of go in her direction by noting that the kerosene lamps that they were using to light the house were completely unknown in Washington's day, when they would have been using candles or whale oil. And so the electric light was no more foreign to Washington than the current lighting they were using, but it was much, much safer and wasn't going to risk burning down the house. So with that threat and that idea, the ladies allowed Thomas Edison to come and wire up Mount Vernon for the electric light. So there's kind of an interesting side note that helps us understand how preservation philosophy and kind of theories of restoration develop over the years. Just to show that the Washington issues didn't go away, and that even in later years, in 1891, the Mary Washington House was saved. And Mary was the mother of George Washington. And what was interesting at this point in time was that the Columbian Exposition in 1892 was the receipt of many buildings were being dismantled and shipped across the country so they could be reassembled in Chicago to show people the history of the nation. So this building, the State House in Boston, a bunch of other buildings were threatened with being shipped off, but the Association for the Preservation of Virginia John Hancock mentioned, demolition has commenced. So here's the house, and here's the man, and there's that famous signature I just threw in for I don't know why. But the interesting thing about the Hancock house is that it refused to die, even though it is one of our losses as preservationists. Hancock had been governor of Massachusetts for years, obviously with a prominent signature on the Declaration of Independence, and he lived in this house from 1776 when he inherited it from his uncle until he himself died in 1839. Now again, his heirs tried, thinking this is John Hancock's house, someone's going to want to use this. They tried to sell it to the state. Hancock himself thought it would be a great residence for future governors. But the state debated back and forth over the years, and you know how that goes. They just couldn't make a decision. In the meantime, two businessmen had bought the land out from under the house, and the state realized, like, well, we could move the house, but we don't have money, we don't have the ability to do that, we don't have a place to put it. So because of this kind of slow bureaucracy, not kind of acting swiftly enough, the house fell in 1863. Charles Hosmer, who's the kind of the most prominent historian of the historic preservation movement, who wrote 3 huge volumes about the early years and only brought us up to the National Trust in the 1850s, he wrote that about the John Hancock House, he wrote, "In dying, the Hancock House contributed more to the preservation movement than it ever could have by remaining intact. Throughout the next 5 or 6 decades, many preservation groups used the house as their rallying cry. So this is really an important reminder for us that through these losses, we're often able to kind of, the phoenix can rise, there's a silver lining, whatever cliche or metaphor you want to use, but we can often rally people through loss. Now, the posthumous history of this house is actually kind of interesting. I'll go through it quickly. In 1893, for the Columbian Exposition, it was actually built, a replica of it, but if you look at the house here, and then you look at the house here, they really took liberties with the design and made it a much grander house. Not that it wasn't grand to start with, than it really was. And people just wanted to memorialize this place. Currier and Ives prints, it was printed onto plates, stereo photo views. The memory of Hancock and the memory of the Founding Fathers was still a very potent force even later in the 19th century. Now, luckily, before it was demolished, an architect named John Sturgis was given access to this. And if we think about HABs today, the Historic American Building Survey, and all the measure drawings they do, a lot of that goes back to John Sturgis deciding, hey, this house is important, and I'm going to document every detail. So he did interior and exterior elevations and plan view drawings of the house. So it was very well documented before it was demolished. And then, strangely, in 1926, for some reason that I still don't quite understand myself, the New York Historical Society decided to build their headquarters in Ticonderoga by rebuilding this according to. So now we have what is probably a very accurate replica of John Hancock's house serving as the headquarters for a New York Historical Society in a town that I can't even say whether Hancock had ever visited or not.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
Series of literary memorials that were developed in the homes of poets and writers were saved so that they could be preserved as house museums where people could see how these men lived and their families just as they could see how the Founding Fathers had lived. Now, Gettysburg is a really interesting preservation example because it happened incredibly quickly. The war was still going on when the Gettysburg National Memorial Association was founded. So this is kind of an example of people really responding quickly to a recent past event, doing something important. The Gettysburg Memorial Association was founded just a year after the battle and before the war was over, as I mentioned, and they bought the land and oversaw the placement of memorials, which began almost immediately. So many of the regiments or the towns where soldiers came from wanted to put a monument at the point where there was an encampment or there was a significant battle or where the forces advanced to a certain line. So the landscape of Gettysburg is dotted with these memorials, and it's really an important example of, and an early example of the preservation of a cultural landscape. So the park was taken over by the national government or the federal government in 1895 as Gettysburg National Military Park. And it's kind of funny to think that a site like this as a park needs to be tended. This would become forest again if saplings weren't pulled out, if plants weren't weeded out. So the idea of grooming this site so that it can recall the appearance of a battlefield and so people can visit the memorials placed there is really important. And it's important to remember that these aren't just pretty open fields. The interpretation doesn't allow you to forget that this is a place that talks about horror and devastation and the sacrifice of war. To end our discussion of the associative phase, I just wanted to kind of take you to a place where we just go, associative era gone wild. This is the weirdest and craziest memorial that I'm familiar with. In 1911, people in Kentucky decided that they wanted to commemorate Lincoln's birthplace. So John Russell Pope, who did the National Gallery in Washington, was called in to design this very classical, very Greek-style memorial. And the idea was that it was to celebrate the place of Lincoln's birth. Well, as we all know from school, Lincoln was born in a cabin. And so here inside this great Greek monument, we have Lincoln's cabin. But it isn't Lincoln's cabin, it's just a cabin. His cabin disappeared sometime before 1865. No one knew exactly what happened with it. And a New York businessman bought his farm, and there was a log structure there that he dismantled. He dismantled some other structures, cobbled some logs together, and built Lincoln's birthplace. And he took it on tour around the country, so it was kind of a money-making opportunity. It's taken apart, rebuilt over and over again. And then when they finally had this memorial built in Kentucky, they brought the cabin in and they realized, oh, damn, it's too big. So they had to cut down both the width and the length of the cabin to get it to fit proportionally into the place. So the idea that here we are celebrating Lincoln's birth through this artifact is so many steps removed from the fact that it becomes more interesting as a memorial to how we memorialize rather than to any real aspects of Lincoln's life. So with that, we move into the second phase. We're in the 20th century now, and we're thinking about a very different country than we had. We're less of an agrarian country, we're more of an urban country, and the Revolution and those early years were no longer living memories. They were history. And this past was receding, but many of its buildings remained intact reminders of those early days. But as opposed to the earlier preservationists who saw them for their associative value, these became more important in their own right, not because of patriotism, not because of who was there, but because of what they were. People began to understand how architectural styles had fluxed and changed over the years. This became more important, and connoisseurs were able to identify good examples solely through the analysis of buildings. It didn't really matter who had been there before. They looked at the buildings and not the history books. So new construction technologies also increased interest in preserving examples of older ones. The preservation movement, as it was at the time, began to focus on aesthetic and cultural aspects of the built environment, and this really set the stage for where we are today. We wouldn't be thinking about some of the sites we think about today without the people who kind of set us on that path. Also in the 19th century, we were dealing with a different world in that the early settlers, who obviously came from other countries themselves, had been Americans, North Americans, United States citizens for many generations by that point. And so the question of who are we as Americans became an issue. As I'm sure you know, there were huge waves of immigration in the second half of the 19th century, and many cities were transformed by these. By 1870, over 30% of Bostonians were either foreign-born or they were the children of foreign parents. There were people who saw these new Americans as a threat to the dominant status quo of the Anglo-Saxon Protestant ethic, and this ethic really did represent the early colonists. So there was this kind of biological attachment to that period that people had trouble letting go of, and the reaction was often not very pretty. So in terms of preserving sites during this period, a lot of them became educational tools to indoctrinate newcomers into the American way. This is how we lived here. These are the lives of people who are important to us here. So the thoughtfulness and accuracy of restoration projects was becoming much better, but we were also kind of weaving political messages into the fabric of our restored buildings. And here's a really fine example of that. Paul Revere's house was built around 1690 in what is now Boston's North End, and he lived there from 1770 until 1800. Now, he's a prosperous merchant, and as I'm sure you know, he's a silversmith. And after he left the house, it went on to be changed fairly dramatically. Later in the century, with the immigrant cultures coming in, Italians settled into the North End, and the house went through various manifestations. It was a tenement house, it was a bank, it was a grocery, and you see an image here on the left when there was a bank in the spot. John Reynolds was Paul Revere's great-grandson. And he was concerned that the memory of his, great-grandfather was going to be lost. So in 1902, he bought the house. And in doing so, it kind of opened up, a lot of the issues that we still face in terms of how do we restore a building. So William Sumner Appleton, who we'll talk about in a minute, was a well-to-do Brahmin, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Bostonian who went on to much bigger things, but he became very involved with this restoration. And some of the work he did was interesting in terms of our current thinking. He anticipated mixed use, for example, by considering that the ground floor could be used as a public library that would then generate revenue through its rent for the museum above celebrating Revere's life. But in the end, the choice was made to restore the house back to its kind of medieval 1690 appearance. And Paul Revere did not know that house. The house had already been changed by the time he saw it. But nonetheless, it was still a deep association. So when the house opened finally in 1908, the former governor of Massachusetts came and spoke to the people and talked about how this was going to be a symbol of the American spirit for the Italian immigrants who lived in the neighborhood. So there's the political message woven into the fabric, and that fabric was restored, perhaps accurately, to a medieval-style early American dwelling, but certainly not to one that Paul Revere would have recognized if he came back and stepped on the street. Appleton's real claim to fame is that he was the founder of SPINEA, which is now called Historic New England, the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. So he founded this group in 1910, and it really set the stage for all of the work that we do since. It was the first regional preservation group. It represented this shift from a patriotic approach to an architectural approach. And we can pretty much say that he's the first professional preservationist in the United States. He actually kind of looked back to the Hancock house when he was designing a seal for the group, and he just had an image of the house with the words, "Destroyed, 1863." So the memory of its loss was still goading him forward. He was also an early proponent of doing surveys and documenting buildings through drawings and photographs, and much of the technical and stylistic knowledge that the early preservation community had, and that we still have today, has its roots in SPINEA's work. What's interesting here was he really focused on the individual buildings. He kind of didn't get the idea of groupings or districts, but he, really did get the idea of like looking at vernacular buildings and finding ways to say these are important. So not everything he preserved or that SPINEA bought was a vernacular building, and here are just a few examples I pulled from several of the properties that the group owns to show, their range from, the kind of vernacular house at the top to the Gropius house from the 30s that was also built in Lincoln, Massachusetts. So SPINEA is of critical importance. I didn't want to suggest that nothing was happening in California. A lot of the histories of preservation kind of focus on things happening back east, but we were definitely doing work in California, and I just wanted to highlight the efforts of Charles Loomis. And I do that because I think he may be in the running for coolest Californian ever. He's a pretty cool guy. He came to Los Angeles via Cincinnati by foot. He came here to be the editor of the LA Times, but on his route he soaked up everything he saw. He befriended Indians, he befriended Mexicans, Spanish settlers, everyone who was there he was talking to and soaking up their cultures. And when he got to California, he became very concerned about the condition of the missions. So he founded the Landmarks Club of California, which is our first statewide preservation group, in 1894 to help fund their restoration. He wrote, "In 10 years from now, unless our intelligence shall awaken at once, there will remain of these noble piles nothing but a few interminable heaps of adobe. We shall deserve and shall have the contempt of all thoughtful people if we suffer our noble missions to fall." So once again, we have a preservationist using this kind of flowery language to kind of rile people up and get us involved. And he was successful. Under their watch, money did go into mission restoration. He was also interesting because he founded the Southwest Museum, the first Los Angeles museum, and he also did all sorts of kind of ethnographic and cultural research. He transcribed songs, he learned how to do old dances. He was very much an interesting character. Excuse me, I just had to change a page. So moving forward, and of course we're moving back east, along with SPINEA, the work that occurred at Colonial Williamsburg is probably the most important project that occurred in the 20th century, not because of the outcome, but because of what people learned from it and the training people got working on that site that then was disseminated around the country. The story of how Colonial Williamsburg became the country's biggest preservation tourist attraction begins with this church, the Bruton Parish Church that was built in 1715. Its rector was W.A.R. Goodwin, the man with the pipe, and he came to Williamsburg, which was pretty much a sleepy town in 1903. It's the former colonial capital of Virginia, but the capital had moved to Richmond years earlier, and since that point the town just kind of went into a quiet senescence. Not much was happening, but not much was changing either. He restored his parish church in 1907 and then was called away. He was sent up to New York State to take on another congregation. But he ended up getting a job with William and Mary College in Williamsburg and came back in 1923 and was shocked to see what had happened. The town had really changed in that period. So he went about trying to solve this problem and find a way to make Williamsburg a place that people could learn from. To do that, he was very smart. He went to where the money was. He went to John D. Rockefeller Jr., and he kind of got it. He saw that Williamsburg was important. He saw the potential there as a restoration site, and slowly and very secretly they started buying up properties around town. And Goodwin's idea was that through restoring Williamsburg, it was going to stir the memory and fire the imagination. And Colonial Williamsburg was opened to the public in 1928. The goal was to bring back the colonial capital as closely as possible. And today it represents about 85% of the original city's area. So here's the main drag, the Duke of Gloucester Street, over the years. And you can see over the years that the colonial homes were changed and Victorian facades were added, Greek Revival buildings were built, all sorts of things happened along there. But when you look at it today, it's, you know, a little bit Disneyfied. It's very much a colonial town again, but with lots of missing teeth and missing buildings. But it's a fascinating preservation kind of laboratory. Nothing built after 1780 was allowed to remain. You can imagine preservationists today, if someone tried to do this, there would be a war on. 720 buildings were demolished. In all, 88 buildings in Williamsburg today are original buildings on their original foundations, and hundreds of other buildings are reconstructions. But what's really most notable about Williamsburg in terms of preservation today is the careful and scientific approach they took to the site. Research guided every step of the way. And at the beginning, they didn't really know what they had or what they could do with it or what had been there. So it was discoveries of things like the Frenchman's map that laid out the town so they could actually see where the buildings were, what their arrangements were, and what their rough footprints were. The biggest discovery was when the three most important buildings in Williamsburg, which no one knew exactly what they looked like, were discovered in England in the Bodleian Library. So the Bodleian plate was used as the reference source for recreating these buildings, the Capitol, the Wren building at the college, and also the governor's palace. Now this kind of scientific method allowed the people working at Williamsburg to learn from their mistakes over the years. And they're not shy about saying, hey, what we did in the 1930s isn't quite right. We're going to change it again so that we can bring it back even closer to its original appearance. So here's one example of the Prentice store, which had become an auto repair place prior to Colonial Williamsburg taking over, then was restored as a store with these kind of bay windows that you see in the middle photo, and then through archaeological evidence and further research, it's been restored today to look like it does in the upper right photo. Williamsburg, in addition to doing research about buildings, has done a lot of social research, and the depiction of slavery has changed over the years. Originally, the black reenactors actually were living in segregated quarters. That's how it was in Virginia at the time. There was little acknowledgement that there were free blacks in Williamsburg, but that's changed in the interpretation of difficult subject matter like slave auctions, and the free condition of the freed blacks is now addressed. Now, as I've alluded to, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of how Williamsburg works and how we are going to an open-air museum like this to understand living history, but you know, I'm not alone, but I also want to say it's really a fascinatingly educational place, and people do get a lot out of it, and it's a huge tourist attraction. And you got to say, when history serves as the source of a major tourist draw, it's really hard for us to complain too much. But I like complaining sometimes, and I enjoy hearing others complain. So here's what Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic, wrote in the 60s. Williamsburg is an extraordinary, conscientious, and expensive exercise in historical play acting in which real and imitation treasures and modern copies are carelessly confused in everyone's mind. Partly because it is so well done, the end effect has been to devalue authenticity and denigrate the genuine heritage of less picturesque periods to which an era and people gave life. So one of the things that we take away from Williamsburg today is that we would never, ever do something like this again today, but the fact that it was done has been a great laboratory for us as preservationists, so we can't be too critical. Some sites, though, we might be able to be critical of. Williamsburg spawned a number of open-air museums, a bunch of which are really interesting and some even more authentic than Williamsburg. There's Sturbridge Village, there's Plymouth Plantation, which is a complete recreation. There's Strawberry Bank in New Hampshire, and also Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. But I wanted to just quickly focus on Henry Ford's project in Dearborn, Michigan. He called it Greenfield Village. And it began in 1929, and the idea of this site was not to bring back the colonial era and how people lived in the colonial era. It wasn't to bring back any specific era in time. It was more to represent an idea. It's a very didactic site and very tied to Henry Ford's personality. So it's not really about patriotism or architecture, it's about genius and the spirit of invention. So qualities he saw in himself, he wanted to bring aspects of that part of him into this site and then use it as an educational facility for visitors. So what he was able to do was relocate Edison's laboratory, which you see in the lower right. He brought in Noah Webster's house where the dictionary was created. He bought the Wright brothers bicycle shop, and in a display of a little bit of lack of humility, his own birthplace he brought. And so he ripped these buildings out of their context. And again, this is something we would never do today if we were building a place like this. Maybe on a smaller scale it happens occasionally, but certainly not like this. But in its own right, it's fascinating. Ford wrote that, "I am collecting the history of our people as written into things their hands made and used. When we are through, we shall have reproduced American life as lived, and that, I think, is the best way of preserving at least a part of our history and tradition." So if any of you have been to Deerfield, you'll know it has absolutely nothing to do with life as lived, but again, is a fascinating site. Here we have Henry and his son Edsel basking in front of what I'm certain is an electric light bulb sitting in a fireplace. So this is by far my favorite picture in this presentation. It really cracks me up. And I use it just as the backdrop for a really amusing New York Times editorial that was written about Ford and Deerfield Village. Has any competent psychologist analyzed Henry Ford's passion for American antiques? The unparalleled Dearborn collection of spinning wheels, Dutch ovens, covered bridges, and other relics of an early American past is the work of a man whose life mission has been to take us away from that past as quickly as might be. The creator of the assembly belt civilization is in love with the old handcraft civilization. Henry Ford adores the horse and buggy. It is as if Stalin went into collecting old ledgers and stock tickers. When Henry Ford walks amid his covered bridges and windmills, is it the conqueror rejoicing in his trophies? Or is it the murderer irresistibly drawn to the resting place of his final victim? That cracks me up, but all of these open-air museums have one thing in common. They're kind of an early expression of the idea of looking at an ensemble of buildings, a group of buildings taken in the context of their development together rather than in the individual merits of any one building. Which brings us to a discussion of what I think is the most important aspect that came out of the aesthetic period in preservation history. It's the one that's probably most important to us today. I think historic districts are the great success story of the preservation movement. Not that there aren't others, but in terms of their power to alter landscapes and to preserve areas that are important to people at the local level, I can't think of anything that surpasses this. And what's interesting when we think about historic districts is, how did we get to the point, just like we talked about how can we regulate the color of that house, how did we get to the point where we can tell citizens what they can or can't do with their private property? And that's the right for us to use the police power that the Constitution established and then was delegated to the states to use, and then from the states to the municipal governments. So I just want to briefly just allude to two cases that are really important in our field. The Euclid case was basically the Supreme Court upheld a city's right to zone. Basically, you could say we can have residential in this area, we can have industrial at this area, but we can't have one in the other area. So the Supreme Court said that the government has a right to zone land uses, and that's very important when we think about historic districts. Jumping ahead a couple of decades to Berman versus Parker, this is the decision that basically proved that we had the right to regulate and to consider aesthetics when we take the public welfare into account. And so this is a hugely important decision that's referred to regularly in preservation battles that go to court, and the government does have a right to consider the appearance of places when we are making our designations. So thinking about historic districts. The first historic district came to be in Charleston, South Carolina. And like many of our preservation stories, this is one that is rooted in a fight to save a single property. So in 1920, the Manigault House was threatened by a proposed Ford dealership. What's amusing is that Ford and Standard Oil, John Rockefeller's company, both play a major role in bad things happening in Charleston and also in ultimately good things happening. So the idea was the Ford dealership wanted to buy the house, tear it down, and build their dealership. A group of citizens banded together to buy the house, but unfortunately their finances were unstable. So they did buy it in 1920, but they lost it. They didn't lose the house, but they ultimately had to accept an offer from Standard Oil to build a gas station on the site. So the house remained, but the gas station was built on the grounds. And what's fun is that they found a successful reuse option. This garden pavilion that you see in the lower right picture was actually saved and became what they used to euphemistically call the gas station's comfort station. So maybe Rockefeller, as a preservationist, did come through in a little way. Here we have another important woman who started a preservation effort that continues to this day. She founded, Susan Pringle Frost, founded the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings, and that happened in 1920 with the purchase of the Manigault House. She was also concerned not just about that site, but about just what was happening around town. There was a market for architectural details. People were stripping wood and ironwork from the buildings. And I have to say, Charleston has one of the most unique and interesting collections of architecture anywhere in the world, and certainly in the country. Sometimes even museums like the Philadelphia Museum and the Metropolitan Museum in New York were buying rooms wholesale, just buying all of the paneling, all of the ceiling details, the floors and everything, and moving them into what they call period rooms in the museums. So she was concerned about the general erosion of architectural character around town. What she was able to do was get people interested in looking at the group of buildings, not just these individual buildings like the Manigault House. And in 1931, the city established the Old and Historic District to protect this oldest neighborhood that was down at the tip of the Charleston Peninsula. Frost and other preservationists were incensed by the loss of 3 houses in this area, and those houses were taken down to make way for another Standard Oil station. So again, preservation resulted from and also benefited from a loss of historic structures. Before we finish up just showing you some of those gas station stories, which is kind of an amusing sidebar, Charleston paved the way for 2 things that are now essential components of preservation programs. They did a resource survey, they did a complete survey of what kind of resources they had that was completed in 1946, and they also created a board of architectural review. It took a long time for Charleston to have the power to deny demolitions, not until the 60s, but if this group hadn't been formed and this district been created, Charleston would not be the city it is today and would not be the major tourist attraction that it is today. Just quickly going through the gas stations, here's the station that Standard Oil built after they tore down the 3 houses. And what's interesting is they hired an architect who's kind of a well-respected preservation architect of the period in Charleston to incorporate classical details from some of the houses that were torn down to create this neo-colonial style gas station. So the idea was they probably were saying, hey, look, it fits in with the architectural character of the neighborhood. It doesn't matter that it's a gas station. In the meantime, in 1936, Standard Oil, in a gesture to the people, donated back the Standard Oil station. So it probably wasn't needed there anymore. I doubt they just did this out of the goodness of their own hearts, but they deeded it back to the city, and ultimately the garden was restored at the Manigault House. Jumping back to this Standard Oil station that was built in the neo-colonial or the classic colonial revival style, it kind of went to pot. You know, the gas station moved out, became an auto body shop, had a few other uses, and kind of just sat there for a long time. And here's the just desserts. It is now the Francis R. Edmonds Center for Historic Preservation. So this is part of the group, one of the preservation groups there, the Historic Charleston Foundation, and it's a preservation research center. So more things change. Do they stay the same? What's going on here? It's really kind of a fascinating trajectory for a building, and to think that it was built as a gas station caused such an uproar, led to such important developments that had nationwide ramifications, and then was captured by a preservation group to serve the people is really an interesting story. Charleston wasn't alone in creating historic districts. In 1936, New Orleans followed suit by designating the French Quarter. In New Orleans, it was a little easier because the French Quarter pretty much stayed the same over the years. Its footprint stayed the same, its street pattern stayed the same, and a lot of its buildings were still intact. And again, we have a historic district that serves as one of the great income generators of the country in terms of tourist dollars. In 1946, Alexandria, Virginia enacted what they called their Charleston Ordinance. So the idea was this Charleston thing was so new that it's like, okay, we're going to do what they did. And of course, since then, we now have thousands and thousands and thousands of resources that are designated. Here's my promised second Talking Heads quote. If any of you are fans, you may know this song. But it's curious, compared to other countries where there's more of a top-down governmental system, that the federal government got into preservation relatively late, especially compared to the efforts in other countries. It was definitely a top-down system here. Top-down system in Europe and Japan, everywhere where there was 19th century preservation efforts at the government level. And as I mentioned here, we are working from the grassroots up. But the federal government did recognize its responsibilities after there were threats and losses. Yellowstone became the first national park in 1872, so here's an example of the government setting aside a piece of land owned by the government and saying this will not be changed. We will not develop this land. We will not sell it off. It's too important as a resource to the American people. The first building that got any sort of federal attention as a preservation site was Casa Grande, these ruins in Arizona. And in 1889, they got some money to go toward their restoration. And in 1892, they became the Casa Grande Ruins Reservation. So this is the first example of federal government looking at a building or a ruined building and saying, okay, this is really important. We are going to step in and protect it. So much so that you have this 1932 umbrella from Frederick Law Olmsted that really, to me, represents a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. It's certainly one of my favorite preservation solutions, and it's a really fun site to visit because that thing is massive. Following up on Yellowstone, in 1906, Yosemite was designated as the second national park. There's just a little sidebar that's interesting about this designation. John Muir invited Teddy Roosevelt to come out on a camping trip and look at Yosemite. And it's kind of amazing to think that all you had to do in that day and age was bring the president out to a site, show him what it looks like, and say, dude, look at this. We've got to do something. We've got to preserve this. And at that point it worked, and Roosevelt enacted legislation to allow it to be part of a national park. So the political aspect of preservation was a little easier back in the day, but the government wasn't really acting in any kind of concerted, organized way. And that changed in 1906 with what is the first piece of preservation legislation that's very important in terms of what followed and what we have today. The Antiquities Act was the first piece of legislation, as I mentioned, and it allowed the government to kind of designate national monuments on federally owned land. And in terms of how the Constitution distributes power, the federal government only has control over the federal lands it owns. Otherwise, the states and then ultimately municipalities have control. But what the federal government's programs did was kind of set the stage and set a pattern of development that was then followed by the states in later years. So it's very important to understand this area. The legislation did not come out of thin air. It was enacted primarily because there were a lot of people going out into the Southwest. They were called pot hunters, and they were just digging up important archaeological sites without any care for studying or understanding them, just to get artifacts that then could be sold on the market. So the government came in and gave authority to the executive branch instead of Congress. And this was a really forward-thinking move because it helped insulate preservation from politics. It wasn't like it became an election issue for each representative and senator. It became something that we focused on, as an entity from the executive level rather than from the elected representative level. And then in 1916, the National Park Service was formed. And this is important because you think national parks, you think Yosemites and Yellowstones, but ultimately the National Park Service became the repository for all historic preservation efforts at the federal government level. The Depression hit America super hard, I don't have to tell you that, and one of the results was that the Franklin Roosevelt administration enacted the Civil Works Administration. This was an umbrella for the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a group of unemployed younger men who were able to go onto sites and restore them in terms of battlefields. They worked on archaeological sites. They worked on reconstructing important historic sites. And for us, it's pretty cool to think this is when HABs came to pass. Architects were out of work. No buildings were being built. What do you do with a bunch of unemployed architects? You have them go study buildings. You have them do these fantastic measured drawings down to the tiniest profile of a door molding. We have an understanding of some of these old buildings, many of which don't exist anymore. And then they also did a lot of this great rectified photography, very distinctive and very useful for us today to kind of understand when we're trying to restore sites. If we have an old photo of it, you know, we're going to be a million steps ahead than if we didn't. Finally, the 1935 Historic Sites Act was enacted, and this was because the federal government recognized that we were doing a lot. We had a lot of pots going and we had a lot of people working, but we didn't have kind of a single way to kind of control and understand how to move forward. So what this Historic Sites Act did was put the National Park Service and Department of Interior in charge of all of these federally owned sites. And it made the declaration for the first time that it is a national policy to preserve for public use historic sites, buildings, and objects of national significance. HABs had been a temporary project just as part of the Make Work CWA era stuff. Historic Sites Act codified it and made it a permanent project. And it also kind of established an idea to survey and designate significant sites as being of importance. So it was really the beginning of the National Landmarks Program. So this brings us to the professional era. I know this has been a whirlwind of a tour, but all of these steps were so important for us to get to where I can today say, I love buildings, I love history, I became a historic preservationist, I went out and got a degree in historic preservation, and with that degree I can say, I understand this field and please give me a job. And I've been lucky to have a bunch of interesting jobs over the years as a professional, but when I talk about the professional era, that's not just talking about those of us who actually get paid to do this. It's talking about volunteers and advocacy groups. And the people, you know, still coming from the grassroots, will never not be a grassroots movement, who are moving us forward and helping us broaden our understanding of what's important and how we can preserve different types of sites that we've never really considered before. The real start of the professionalization of the movement came with the establishment of the National Trust. So Congress established a group based on the British National Trust that was kind of a quasi-governmental, quasi-private group that has really spearheaded preservation efforts over the years. Say what you will about the trust and the buildings that they own, because they own a number of house museums. Here are two examples. But what I think is really important to remember is without the trust, we wouldn't have developed the level of professionalism and the development of the skills that led to the creation of the National Historic Preservation Act, which I'll get to in a minute. That act really came about because of the huge changes that happened in the country after the war. Housing and transportation primarily drove a lot of interest in preservation because there were so many changes happening so quickly. Slum clearance was going on since the Depression. New housing projects were being built in urban centers around the country. In Los Angeles, we lost Bunker Hill and gained a new downtown. And the freeways just devastated neighborhoods, tore apart areas that had been vibrant, you know, historic fabric with connected neighbors and neighborhoods for generations were just erased overnight through the creation of freeways. There were many people who came to help solve this problem. There were a lot of people who were concerned. Jane Jacobs gets a lot of credit for this, and I think she deserves a lot of it, but there were many, many other people. What's interesting about Jacobs is she wasn't really what I would call a historic preservationist. She's kind of more of a planner, and she was more of just a neighbor, really understanding her area. And her area was New York City, specifically Greenwich Village, and a lot of her writing is prejudiced toward this kind of landscape, which frankly most cities don't have. We don't have these quaint streets and this wonderful change of scale from the old tenement buildings to the apartment buildings to the big modern 20th century buildings. But it's very important to think that what she did was just open our eyes. She fought against freeway construction and won. She made us realize the value of old buildings, not necessarily historic buildings, but just the presence of old buildings and how they actually enhance the economic balance in a neighborhood. And I think that may be ultimately her most important feat. Based on a lot of what was going on, the government started getting antsy. They knew people out in the communities were concerned about the rate of change and how it was devastating cities. So in 1965, the White House held a conference on natural beauty, and they created a special committee on historic preservation in conjunction with the United States Conference of Mayors. This led to the publication of a seminal work in preservation history with Heritage So Rich. It was published in 1966. The National Trust was very involved in this, along with the Council of Mayors, and it basically alerted us to what was going on out in the world, what we had and what we were losing. Lady Bird Johnson, another notable lady preservationist, wrote the foreword for the book, and the statistic is kind of shocking. At the time it was written, 12,000 of the structures recorded by HABs had either been demolished or destroyed. Isn't that the same thing? I'm not sure why I wrote it that way. But 12,000 buildings since 1933 that had been documented were lost. And that was really the most important aspect of this book. It kind of alerted us to, like, we've got to do something. And that something is the National Historic Preservation Act. Everything we do today at the state level, at the local level, or the federal level revolves in one way or another around the NHPA. And this was interestingly drafted by the staff of the National Trust. So I think ultimately it's the greatest contribution the Trust has made to American preservation. And its impacts were wide-ranging. It established an Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation in the Park Service, so now we have a dedicated place to go when we have questions and concerns at the national level about preservation issues. It established the National Register of Historic Places. It created Section 106 review, so that any federally funded project has to be reviewed to make sure it doesn't have an impact on cultural resources. For us here in California, because we have such a great SHPO office, it created the State Historic Preservation Offices, which help distribute federal funding to municipalities like Glendale and your towns, hopefully, and also just a great repository of information for us. The Act also created the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The Secretary of the Interior standards weren't built into the Act, but they were enabled by the Act. They came to pass in 1976, and the Certified Local Government Program came through as an amendment in 1980. In the private sector, along with all of these developments, there was a growing recognition in the 60s and 70s as we became more of a professional, organization and movement that preservation pays. So these festival marketplaces realized it's better to preserve the old buildings than tear them down, that people want to be in these places, even if they're shopping malls, they still want to be in this historic environment. The Trust's Main Street program had a huge impact, especially in small towns around the country where the downtown business districts had just lost almost everything in some cases. And this is one of the Trust's great successes. The greatest success of federal preservation efforts in recent years is the Federal Rehabilitation Tax Credit, where originally you could get a 25% tax credit. Now it's a 20% tax credit for certain rehabilitation work that is performed on buildings that are on or eligible for the National Register. Tons and tons of great stuff has been preserved through this and restored. But for many people, more importantly, billions of dollars have been leveraged and hundreds of thousands of jobs have been created working on these projects. So it's truly one of our greatest success stories. I'm going to close with a couple of things, but we can't stop without talking about the Penn Central decision. This is the third major Supreme Court case that affects historic preservation. And basically, when Penn Central wanted to build a Marcel Breuer Tower on top of Grand Central Terminal in New York, the city said no. Penn Central sued, went all the way up to up to the Supreme Court, and the decision came down that yes, the cities have a right to designate buildings and protect historic buildings. So again, this is one of these decisions that we still use today that's still important to us because a lot of what we do basically stands on the fact of, do we have the right to make these decisions? And thank God that we have this amazing public space left today. This would have been decimated if the building had been built above it. I throw George Washington's teeth in to just remind you, and we're not going to go into any discussion of local level preservation except to say it's where the teeth are, and it's where we can really do our strongest work. And as disembodied people out there listening to my disembodied voice, I have no idea what your backgrounds are or what you do in preservation or what your interest level is, but always start with your local groups and your local city government if you have issues, because through the distribution of power in the country, we really have the power and we have the expertise, and thank God we can rely on the state and the federal government to back us up, and we can learn from all of the work that's been performed by preservationists, by people who would never even know what that word meant, but just cared about buildings and saw that they're the seats of memory and that they are places that are really important to us. I wanted to close going back to Philadelphia, just around the corner from Independence Hall, to show Ben Franklin's house. This is how we've matured as a preservation entity. If you're asking yourself, how did we get to the point where we can say that these cartoon outlines of houses in Philadelphia represent Ben Franklin's house? It's because of everything that we've learned from the people who came before us. And if you ask me, I hope you've been here. If you haven't, you have to check it out when you go to Philadelphia. It's one of the most fantastic preservation sites you'll ever see. Very interesting and reflects all of the aspects of our education over the last 200 years. So I hope this has been informative. I hope it's been helpful for you. It's a subject I really enjoy, and I look forward to any questions that you guys might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay.
You're
Are
welcome.
there any questions out there today for Jay? You can type it in to the box.
Or just say hello so I know someone's out there.
They're all out there still. I can see them.
Okay.
Oh, we got some hellos.
Hello, thank you.
And some thanks. All right, so first question for you. What is your perspective on infill in historic districts?
I think infill opportunities in districts are a great opportunity for us as a movement. And I think, if you guys are working as preservationists, everything is case by case. I'm very open personally to very contemporary infill in a historic area. I also recognize that some people may not appreciate that and may want to go back to kind of older styles, more in keeping with what was built 80 or 90 years ago in a historic district. I think as a field, one of the signs of our maturity is that we have many options. We have lots of ideas and we have lots of potential. If going back, and I keep harping back to Philadelphia, but when you look at the Society Hill neighborhood, there's some really, really beautiful kind of modern 1970s infill housing in the city's oldest historic neighborhood. And when you look at it, for me, it's just beautiful. It works so well. But then I've seen lots and lots of really nice examples of people working very closely with the styles around them. I think what's important is to just remember that we're in the 21st century now, and we want our buildings to reflect who we are, just as the buildings of the past reflect the people who built them.
Okay, thank you. Did anybody else have any more questions? Okay, not seeing any. Well, thank you again for all of you joining us today. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to a survey. We would appreciate any feedback on this webinar, as well as recommendations for future topics. If you need anything or if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email or give me a call. And I hope all of you have a good rest of the afternoon. Talk to you soon. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.